I'm Grace Trafton of The Better Part. Change is inevitable in all societies, and China has been experiencing this at warp speed. What doesn't always keep pace with societal changes are traditions. Stay tuned and hear about the coming-of-age story of a young Chinese woman who is trying to find her place in a complex, changing modern world while being pulled by China's traditional culture, a story which may have universal familiarity. Jana McBurney-Lin lived in Asia for many years and has written for media in 7 countries and in over 40 publications. Now living in the Santa Cruz Mountains with her family, Jana is a past president of the Peninsula branch of California Writers Club, and she is the founder of the Writers Camp for Kids. My Half of the Sky, her first novel, has won several awards. Welcome, Jana.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate being included on your show.
It's our pleasure, believe me.
Oh, thank you.
Before we discuss your book, can you first tell us about some of your history and your background?
Sure. I was born in a small town outside of Chicago, Illinois, called Wilmette. And I was thinking yesterday, I remember growing up, I didn't have any contact with Asia at all. In fact, there was one Chinese takeout place that served chop suey and fortune cookies, and that was what I knew about Asia.
Oh, great.
But my parents were involved in an organization called the Institute of Cultural Affairs, and they went to different locations, like including the ghettos of Chicago, but India, Japan, South Pacific, and they would arrange these conferences with the local leaders to find out what is the problem. What is the problem that is plaguing your people, and what's the best way to solve that? And so they would go on these round-the-world trips, and they would come back and tell me about Japan or India. And I first got interested in something outside my little town. When I was a sophomore in high school, my parents' friends who lived in Kobe, Japan, and were also part of the ICA, said, would Jana like to come live with us for a year? And I thought, yeah, why not? I've been hearing about these places, and somebody's offering me a trip there.
That sounds exciting.
It was fascinating. It was really a pivotal point, I think, in my life, because I was exposed to a culture that was different than my own, different traditions, different arts. I participated in kabuki and learned a bit of the language, and came back all excited about Japan and realizing how small my town was.
And so where did you go to college, and what did you do after you graduated?
Well, I went as far away as I could to the East Coast, Bates College in Maine, and I studied communications as well as taking a minor in Japanese. And at the time, there was one Japanese class, the beginner Japanese class. And so I kept pushing and said, well, I want beyond beginner. So I ended up being the first minor in the college in Japanese.
Wow, good for you.
Yeah, and well, now it's all over the place. But when I graduated, it was the middle of the 80s, and we were in the midst of a recession. And I remember I had my degree in hand, and nobody wanted it.
Oh.
So I ended up being a Yellow Pages directory delivery person. And that was okay, but it wasn't what I had studied.
Right.
But my parents were very generous, and they had given me a down payment on a new car as a graduation gift. And after watching me struggle to enjoy delivering Yellow Pages to each house for a couple months, they said, don't buy a new car. Buy an airplane ticket instead. go to Japan, learn the language, and you can write your own ticket. So that's what I did.
That's what you did.
Off I went.
So how long did you end up living in Japan?
Well, to be honest, I only planned to spend a year, which shows you my youthful naivete, perhaps a little arrogance. But every single year I'd come back home for Christmas, and my father would say, "So, when are you coming back?" And I'd say, "Oh, just one more year, just one more year." And I realized it wasn't just because I kept thinking, "Oh, give me one more year to get this language under my belt," but because I'd fallen in love with the culture and the traditions, and I enjoyed writing about them for different magazines and interpreting their culture, basically, for other people.
So was your career goal to be a writer?
Not at all. I wanted to go into international business.
Oh.
But I had several odd jobs in Japan. For example, I was on Naruhodo the World, which is a Japanese quiz show.
Oh.
And I worked at a publishing company called ALC Publishing, and correcting the English side of their magazines. And then I also taught English. And one of the places that I taught English was at the National Diet, which is the Japanese form of Congress, Senate, kind of melded into one. And I was teaching the secretaries of this Japanese Diet member. And she was a woman. And in fact, she was one of the only women in the building. And I thought, oh, I got to meet her.
Yes.
And after I met her, I said, "What is your biggest challenge, being one of the only women in this building?" And I expected her to say something like, "Oh, being surrounded by all this testosterone is very challenging," but she didn't. She said, "Going to the bathroom."
Oh, my goodness.
And it was because they had no women's bathrooms in the entire building.
Oh,
and this was
goodness.
1986, I think.
Not that long ago.
No. And I thought, gosh, everybody needs to hear this. And that was my first article, because I thought somebody needs to hear this story of what's going on.
Yes. So that was your first article.
That was my first article in a major magazine, yeah.
Oh, how interesting.
Yeah.
Now, how did you meet your husband, Lin?
Well, that's also interesting. I had a Japanese friend who called me one week and said, "Would you like to play tennis?" Well, first of all, I don't really play tennis. And secondly, playing tennis in Tokyo is a major undertaking. You have to get on this crowded train after that crowded train, and then push your way onto a bus and go all way out in the middle of nowhere to play tennis or chase a bunch of balls around. So my immediate response was, "I don't know, no thank you." But before I responded, I was speaking to a Canadian friend that I had met there, and she said, "Oh, I love tennis. Say yes and take me." So I thought, well, you know, being on a bus or a crowded train with a friend is a lot different. I arrived at the tennis court only to see this Chinese man there. And I was so excited to tell him all about my trip to China. And it turned out that he also had been invited by our mutual friend and had not wanted to come. He was in the midst of writing his thesis, and he was under a lot of pressure, but he had refused this woman twice already, and he thought, if I refuse her another time, she's going to read into it more than I intend, so I might as well just go. So he was there, and we had a great conversation and exchanged phone numbers, and over the months we exchanged traditions. For example, I invited him for a Thanksgiving celebration at my apartment, and he invited me to Chinese New Year at his apartment, and we just got closer and closer and finally got married.
Now, what inspired you to write this book, My Half of the Sky?
Well, to back up a bit, when we got married in Tokyo, Japan, and this was in 1990, a year after the Tiananmen massacre in Beijing. And so my parents were able to come, my siblings were able to come. his parents were not allowed out of China.
Oh.
But they did send a tape, and on the tape they said, do not come home.
Oh.
So it was many years before we visited his village. And I remember very distinctly when we went, this was 1996, when we finally went to his family home. And we were walking down the road, and on the side of somebody's house was this huge painting. And it depicted a couple holding a little baby, and underneath were the characters, a girl baby is just as precious as a boy. And I remember I turned to him and I said, oh my gosh, that is so cool. Obviously the government is behind the valuation of little girls. Mm-hmm. And he just shook his head and said, well, it doesn't matter what the government says. The fact of the matter is, a house with no male is a real problem. And that's when I thought, oh my gosh, people need to hear this.
Right.
But at the same time, there was so much I wanted to include that it would not have fit in a magazine article. So that's when I started trying to write fiction rather than doing nonfiction.
So that was the inspiration for your book.
That was the inspiration for my book. And the reasoning behind the title, My Half of the Sky, the late leader of China, Chairman Mao, said that women hold up half the sky. And it's easy to say women hold up half the sky, women are equal, women share the burden equally. It's a different matter when your traditions are not allowing for that.
Right, right. So can you give us a brief synopsis of the story?
Sure, yeah. It's the story of a contemporary young Chinese woman named Li Hui.
Now this happened in the 90s, takes place in the 90s.
96, yeah. And she's just graduated with a degree in teaching from Xiamen University down in southern China. And she has all these ideas of what she wants her future to be. And in fact, she's rare in the fact that she graduated from college, because most people in the village don't graduate from college. So she's a rare species, and has all these ideas of what her future could be like, so many dreams, and they're chipped away at with traditions. And this is her struggle. How does she break free?
Now, what do you think are some of the universal themes that we can identify with her story?
Well, the major theme is tradition versus the modern momentum of our world. And I would say there are a lot of leeways, not just Chinese leeways, there are leeways all over the place. For example, I remember in Japan, I had a next door neighbor who was about my age, and she came over one night with birthday cake. She said, oh, today's my birthday, will you help me celebrate? And so I asked, what had been the highlight of her year and what she was planning to do next year, and what was her goal for the year. And she said, oh, I'm getting married. And I said, really? I didn't even know you had a boyfriend. And she said, oh, I don't. In Japan, there is a saying, a woman is like a Christmas cake. After the 25th, she's no good anymore.
Oh, my goodness.
And this was her 25th birthday. And so she thought, oh, I better get married fast, because tradition says I have to get married by the 25th year.
Oh, my goodness.
And then even in myself, I've noticed leeway. I can remember when my daughter was graduating from kindergarten, and I went out and I bought her this beautiful Chinese dress and little Chinese slippers. And then I spent about 3 hours trying to convince her to wear it, because she didn't want to wear a dress. She's very much a tomboy. So she wanted to wear her pants and her sweatshirt and her gym shoes. And I said, no, you have to wear this dress because it's a celebration. So she finally agreed to wear the dress if she could wear the gym shoes with it. And by that point, I was so stressed out, I thought, oh, whatever, yes. But going to the ceremony, I thought, What difference does it make, if she dresses up for kindergarten graduation or not? And I realized that I was using tradition, what I thought should be the proper way to do things, to dictate what my daughter should do. And sometimes I catch myself. I think Li Hui and her story is very universal.
Now, Li Hui made some decisions that might be difficult for Westerners to understand. Could you describe some of the situations where Westerners may feel it's controversial?
Well, to start out with, when she graduated from Teachers College, she was offered a job. It wasn't a great job, but it was a teaching job, which is what she wanted to do. And her father intervened and said, no, that's not good enough. You need a better job than that. And her father intervened many places along the line. He found her a job. Then he wanted her to get married, so he arranged the marriage. And arranged marriages are not unique to China. I realize they happen all over the place, even in the United States. So that's not necessarily special to East Asia or Asia. But the constant intervention of her dad and her respect for her father are probably not as recognizable in Western society.
Do you think his excessive intervention in her life is pretty commonplace? Is this pretty accepted in the Chinese tradition?
I would say so.
Even today?
I would say so.
Really?
Yeah. And certainly in China, at least in the village, maybe not in the big cities like Shanghai and Beijing.
So it could be due to rural versus city life and the different cultural differences between East and West?
It could be. I remember I was at a book talk at De Anza College, and one of the students that was there was from Shanghai. And she said, this is not how things are done in Shanghai. So
the rural and urban could be quite different. Lots of contrast there, huh?
Yeah. The further away you are from the big cities, the more the tradition tends to stick, I would say.
Yeah, that's
even
reasonable.
in the U.S.
Right,
yeah.
Absolutely. So I was curious, how were you able to put yourself into the shoes of this young Chinese woman, not having been born into a Chinese family and not being raised in China?
Well, when we married in Tokyo, and then my husband graduated, and he experienced some similar issues finding a job as I had when I was in college. And so we went to Singapore, which that's another long story in itself. But in Singapore, his parents were given immediate permanent residence because Singapore and China have a very close relationship.
Oh, I see.
So they came over to visit. And it's interesting, when I heard that they were coming to visit, I had in my mind 7-10 days, because my parents would come visit, and 10 days always felt like they were done. Mm-hmm. So I cleared my calendar for 10 days and planned where do I want to show them, like the Raffles Hotel, Sentosa Island, some of the museums, and I'm planning this tourist package, basically. Mm-hmm. Well, then they showed up at the airport, both lugging 2 huge suitcases. And I thought, that looks longer than 10 days. Well, they ended up staying for 6 months.
Oh, my goodness.
And during that time, I was kind of initiated into their world because they weren't interested in going to look at things. They wanted to stay at home with their grandchild.
Oh.
And the foods that I would normally cook, like a salad for dinner, because it's so hot in Singapore. You don't want to be sitting in the kitchen making flames, cooking up something really hot. But the things that I was used to eating, like salad, they wouldn't touch it, because salad in the village, unless it's boiled, it's full of germs.
Oh,
so they
see.
probably thought I was trying to poison them. But they told me a lot of stories
About
their growing up. The traditional stories they had heard. So that's how I felt that perhaps I could understand, I could see this village through their eyes. They showed me their village. And as I was mentioning before, I've met a lot of Lihuis, and I did meet a lot of Lihuis in Singapore who were from China and who were undergoing the same kinds of struggles that Lihui did.
What are the messages that you want the audience to take away from Lihui's journey through life?
I guess the main message would be to always question, why do we do things this way? Why every year is there this tradition? Why is this important? So why? Because sometimes we just get so caught up in doing things the way they were done that we don't even bother to ask why we're doing them in the first place.
And particularly in Li Hui's situation, she often did not ask why, did she?
No, but it was through Chan Hai, the man that she met in the village, that she started to question, oh, this isn't right. Yeah.
So this story takes place in the 1990s, and so much has changed in the intervening years in China, as we all know. So if Li Hui's story unfolded today, would she be facing the same dilemmas that she faced back in the 90s?
Definitely not. Things would be different. For example, in the 90s, when you graduated from college, your professor found you a job and assigned you to that job. Today, that's not the case. So there's a lot more internal questioning, internal direction that needs to take place. It's not all externally motivated. But I think some things still remain the same. Some attitudes still remain the same. And I guess those are the traditions that I'm talking about. The attitudes towards women, the attitudes towards baby girls. I think that has not changed as much in the village as in the bigger areas.
So it's still in a process of changing.
Yeah.
Do you think the villages are catching up?
I don't know. It's hard to answer that. But whenever I go back to the village, and I go back maybe once every 2 years now.
To the village?
To the village, to see the family. And I'm always struck by how some traditions just keep hanging on. And actually, I was talking to my nephew who lives in the village. And we had been to a celebration, a funeral actually, where they passed out cigarettes to all the guests. Oh. And I said, this doesn't make sense. These are cancer sticks.
Right.
And he said, oh, Jana, you don't understand. This is our tradition. And I thought, well, it can't have been that long of a tradition, maybe 50 years, when tobacco was readily handed out in China. So maybe you should question. But he said, no, I can't question. That's the tradition of the village.
Oh, I see. So did you say the male babies are still more desirable today, or it's hard to fathom right now?
Well, I don't really know, statistically speaking. I know I read an article recently in the Washington Post that there are 35 million more men than women in China right now. it will take a really long time to change the demographic chaos that has been created.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever thought about writing a sequel? Because I'm sure a lot of your readers have been wondering, whatever happened to Li Hui?
Well, it's interesting you should ask. When I first finished this book, I thought, that's it. You know, I want the reader to decide what happens to Li Hui next. But I got so many people asking me to write a sequel that I started a sequel.
Oh, you did?
Yes, and I'm still working on it. But in the intervening years, I had other subjects just come my way that I couldn't say, oh, you know, I'll get back to you in 3 years or whatever. I was at a writer's conference signing books, and this gentleman approached me and said, your book reminds me of old Korea. Will you help me tell my story? And this man, Dr. Hee-dong Chai, he grew up in Seoul, Korea, right before World War II. And he was the son of one of the first Christian ministers in Korea. And this was at a time when Japan occupied Korea, so your only choice of God was Emperor Hirohito. Mm. And his father refused to renounce his religion, refused to close his church, and for that the entire family suffered. And I heard his story and I thought, that's a story that needs to be told.
So you wrote another book.
So I wrote another book. It's called Blossoms and Bayonets.
Well, I'd be interested in hearing about that book maybe next time.
Oh, I would love that. I'd love to talk to you about it.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Jana. I really enjoyed hearing about your story.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been a great time. I appreciate it.
What an interesting story Jana has shared with us. Thank you for being with us today, and be sure to also watch us on YouTube and Roku. See you next time. Bye-bye.